There's a kind of storytelling that doesn't need anything big to happen to feel intense. No dramatic chase, no sudden twist, no moment where everything changes in an instant. And yet somehow it feels heavier, more personal, more difficult to shake off once it settles in. And that's the space All in the Family lives in so comfortably, especially when you start to notice how emotion quietly replaces action. How what matters isn't what the characters do, but what they feel, how they react. How those reactions ripple through the room and change the air itself. And I keep coming back to one particular kind of situation that really brings that into focus. One where the topic shifts towards something deeply personal and fragile. Something like fear, not the loud kind, not the kind that leads to dramatic action, but the quiet kind. The kind that sits just beneath the surface and shapes how people speak, how they listen, how they misunderstand each other. It usually begins without much warning, maybe with Archie watching the news, something about crime, something about the city changing, something that taps into his sense of unease, and at first it seems like background noise, just another evening, just another program flickering on the television. But then he reacts, and the way he reacts isn't just about the story on the screen. It's about what it represents to him. The idea that the world is becoming unfamiliar, unpredictable, and that fear doesn't come out as vulnerability. It comes out as frustration, as defensiveness, as certainty. He says something that carries that weight, something that sounds like an opinion but feels like a shield, and immediately the room shifts. Mike hears it and responds, because he can't let that kind of thinking go unchallenged, not when it touches on prejudice, on assumptions, on the kind of fear that turns into division, and his response is logical, structured, trying to break down the idea, to expose where it comes from. Gloria feels it differently, because for her, it's not just about being right or wrong, it's about the emotional tone of the conversation, the way it affects the people in the room, the way it reflects the kind of world she wants to live in, and her reaction carries that emotional urgency. And as always, responds in her own way, not by arguing, not by dissecting the issue, but by trying to understand, by offering a kind of emotional softness that doesn't erase the fear, but changes how it's held in the room. And what's fascinating is that nothing really happens in the traditional sense. There's no action driving the scene forward, no external event that forces a resolution. Everything is driven by emotion, by the way each character feels and expresses those feelings. Archie's fear becomes the starting point, even if he doesn't name it as fear, even if he presents it as certainty or logic. It's there, shaping everything he says. Mike's frustration and determination to challenge that fear becomes the counterforce, pushing the conversation forward, refusing to let it settle into silence. Gloria's emotional responses add intensity, making the stakes feel personal rather than abstract. And kindness creates moments of pause, moments where the tension softens just enough to breathe. The living room becomes this container for all of it, this space where emotion can't escape, where it builds, overlaps, shifts, and that's what gives the show its unique energy. There's no need for action because the emotion itself becomes the movement, the progression, the thing that carries the scene from one moment to the next. And the way the conversation unfolds reflects that it doesn't follow a clear path. It moves in waves, rising and falling, circling back, sometimes escalating, sometimes softening, always shaped by how the characters feel in that moment. The humor comes from that emotional interplay, not from carefully constructed jokes, but from the way people react, from the way they misunderstand each other, from the way their emotions lead them into unexpected directions. You might laugh at how Archie expresses his fear, at how it comes out as something blunt or exaggerated, and then you might laugh at Mike's response, at how he tries to dismantle that fear with logic, sometimes missing the emotional core of it. Gloria's reactions might bring a different kind of humor, something more immediate, more expressive, and gentle presence adds moments of warmth that feel almost like relief. But that laughter is never separate from the tension. It exists alongside it, sometimes because of it. And that's what made All in the Family so groundbreaking in the 1970s, because it allowed those two things to coexist, to reinforce each other. At a time when television often relied on action, on clear plot developments, on stories that moved from point A to point B, this show chose to stay in the room, to stay in the moment, to explore what happens when people talk, when they feel, when they react. And it trusted that those moments were enough, that they could carry the weight of the story without needing anything external to push them forward. The social context of that time adds another layer, because the fears being expressed, the frustrations, the hopes, they were all part of a larger cultural shift. A country grappling with change, with uncertainty, with new ideas challenging old ones. And the show didn't present those changes through big events. It presented them through conversations, through emotional reactions, through the way those changes affected everyday life. As the scene continues, you start to notice how the emotions don't resolve neatly, how they linger, how they shift but don't disappear. There might be a moment where Archie softens slightly, where something says reaches him in a way that Mike's arguments didn't, and for a brief second, it feels like something might change. But then the conversation moves on, and that moment passes, and while it leaves an impression, it doesn't transform everything. Mike might feel a sense of frustration, realizing that logic alone isn't enough to break through. Gloria might feel the emotional weight of the situation and continues to hold onto that sense of kindness that keeps everything from becoming too harsh. And as the scene winds down, there's no big resolution, no clear victory, just a gradual easing of tension. A return to something quieter, something more manageable. But the emotions are still there, just beneath the surface, ready to rise again in another conversation, another moment. Watching it now, you can still feel how relevant that approach is, because so much of life works that way. So much of our interactions are driven by emotion rather than action, by how we feel rather than what we do. And there's something powerful about seeing that reflected so honestly, about recognizing that the most important things don't always happen in big, visible ways. They happen in conversations, in reactions, in the way people respond to each other. As the living room grows quiet again, as the characters settle back into their routines, there's a sense that nothing and everything has changed at the same time, that the conversation has added something, even if it hasn't resolved anything. And maybe that's the real strength of the show. The way it understands that emotion can carry a story just as effectively as action, sometimes even more so. Because action can be forgotten, but emotion lingers, it stays with you. It shapes how you remember the scene, how you think about it afterward. So when you think about All in the Family in that way, it becomes less about what happens and more about what is felt, about the invisible shifts that take place in a room full of people trying to understand each other. And that's the kind of storytelling that doesn't fade easily, because it doesn't rely on spectacle. It relies on something deeper, something more human. And sitting with that, letting those moments settle, you realize that the show isn't asking you to follow a story. It's asking you to listen, to feel, to stay in that room a little longer than you might expect, and maybe notice something about the way people connect, the way they clash, the way they carry their emotions into every word they say. And when it ends, it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a pause, like the conversation is still happening somewhere, just out of view, still shaped by those same emotions, still waiting to be picked up again.